I never thought I'd be the type of person to destroy someone's career, but Marcus Williams pushed me to a place I didn't know existed. What he did to me wasn't just unfair, it was calculated, cruel, and he made one fatal mistake: he underestimated exactly how much I knew about our company's inner workings. It started 18 months ago when I was working as a senior analyst at Davidson & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm in downtown Chicago. I'd been there for 6 years, climbed my way up from an entry-level position, and I was damn good at my job. My clients loved me, my projects always came in on time and under budget, and I had the respect of everyone in the office. Everyone except Marcus. Marcus joined our team as a lateral hire about 2 years before this all went down. He came from a competitor with a flashy resume and an even flashier personality. Within weeks, he was schmoozing with upper management, taking credit for collaborative projects, and positioning himself as the golden boy of our department. But I didn't mind at first. The company was growing, there was room for everyone to succeed, and I figured his ambition would eventually catch up with his actual performance. I was wrong. The first red flag came during the Henderson Industries project. I'd been working on their account for 3 months, developing a comprehensive strategy to streamline their supply chain operations. The work was complex, involving multiple stakeholders across different time zones, and I'd put in countless late nights to get everything perfect. The presentation was scheduled for a Friday morning, and I was confident we'd land the contract extension. Thursday night, I got a text from Marcus at 11:47 p.m., "Hey, can't make it to the Henderson presentation tomorrow. Food poisoning. You've got this though." I found it strange since he'd seemed fine when we'd grabbed coffee that afternoon, but people get sick. I adjusted the presentation to cover his portions and went to bed, figuring I'd handle it solo. I'd done it before. Friday morning, I'm in the conference room setting up when my boss, Janet, walks in with Marcus right behind her. He's dressed in his best suit, looking perfectly healthy, carrying a leather portfolio I'd never seen before. "Sorry I'm late," he says with a grin. "Feeling much better now?" I'm confused, but before I can ask what's going on, the Henderson team arrives. Marcus immediately takes charge, greeting everyone like he's been their primary contact all along. He launches into the presentation using my slides, my research, my recommendations, but he's presenting it like it's his work. Every time I try to contribute, he smoothly redirects the conversation. "That's a great point from Sarah," he'd say, "but let me expand on the strategy one developed." And then he'd elaborate on my ideas as if I was just there to support his vision. The Henderson team was impressed. They signed the extension on the spot, and Marcus basked in the congratulations. I stood there, watching 3 months of my work being attributed to someone else, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. After the meeting, I confronted him privately. "What the hell was that, Marcus?" "That was my project, my research, my strategy." He shrugged, adjusting his tie. "It was a team effort, Sarah. You know how these things work. Besides, I had to step up when you seemed overwhelmed." "Overwhelmed? I had everything under control until you." "Look," he interrupted, "I'm just trying to help the team succeed. If you're feeling insecure about your contributions, maybe we should talk to Janet about getting you some additional support." The audacity was breathtaking. He'd stolen my work and was now gaslighting me about it. But I kept my cool, smiled, and told him we should definitely discuss it with Janet. That conversation with Janet went exactly as I expected. Marcus had already spoken to her, framing the situation as him having to rescue the presentation when I'd become overwhelmed by the scope. He'd positioned himself as the collaborative team player while painting me as someone who couldn't handle pressure. Janet, who'd always been supportive of my work, seemed genuinely concerned. "Sarah, you've been taking on a lot lately. Maybe Marcus is right about getting you some help." I realized then that this wasn't just about one project. This was a pattern Marcus had been building, and I'd been too focused on my work to see it happening. Over the next few months, I paid attention. Marcus would volunteer for high-visibility projects, then delegate the actual work to junior staff or pressure team members into sharing their research with him. He'd show up to client meetings armed with everyone else's insights, presenting himself as the strategic mastermind behind every success. But he made mistakes. Small ones at first, misunderstanding technical details, making promises he couldn't keep, glossing over important nuances in client requirements. I started documenting these discrepancies, not sure what I'd do with the information, but knowing instinctively that it might be important later. The breaking point came 6 months later when Janet announced that our department was getting a new senior manager position. It was essentially a promotion that would put someone in charge of our entire client portfolio, with a significant salary increase and equity package. I'd been working towards something like this for years. My performance reviews were stellar, my client retention rate was perfect, and I had the deep institutional knowledge that made me invaluable to the company's operations. When Janet posted the position internally, I was confident I'd at least be seriously considered. Marcus, of course, applied immediately. And he didn't just apply, he campaigned. He scheduled coffee meetings with every senior partner, put together a presentation about his vision for the department, and somehow managed to get 3 client testimonials that praised his work on projects I'd actually managed. The interview process was brutal. Not because the questions were difficult, but because I could see how the narrative had been shaped before I even walked into the room. Marcus had spent months positioning himself as the department's star performer, and I was now seen as a solid but unremarkable team player. When they announced that Marcus got the promotion, I wasn't surprised. Disappointed, devastated, but not surprised. What surprised me was what happened next. Marcus called a team meeting his first week in the new role. He talked about restructuring for efficiency and optimizing our client management approach. Then he announced that he was reassigning several of my long-term clients to other team members, including the Henderson account. "Sarah's been carrying a heavy load," he explained to the group. "I think it's time we distributed some of that responsibility so she can focus on her development areas." Development areas. He was essentially demoting me while making it sound like he was doing me a favor. I was being pushed out, and everyone in that room knew it. That night, I went home and seriously considered quitting. I'd been at Davidson and Associates for 6 years, but Marcus had poisoned the well. He was now my boss, he'd systematically undermined my reputation, and he was actively trying to force me out. But as I sat in my apartment, staring at my laptop screen, I realized something important. I knew where all the bodies were buried. 6 years at a consulting firm teaches you a lot about how business really works. I knew about the client contracts that were held together with duct tape and hope. I knew about the promises made to close deals that we'd never be able to keep. I knew about the regulatory compliance issues that kept our legal department up at night. Most importantly, I knew about the Meridian Industries situation. Meridian had been Marcus's first major client acquisition after his promotion. He'd landed them with an aggressive proposal that promised cost savings we couldn't actually deliver. The contract was worth $2.3 million annually, and Marcus had been celebrated as a hero for bringing them in. But I'd been the one tasked with actually implementing the strategy Marcus had sold them. And it was impossible. The timeline was unrealistic, the cost projections were fantasy, and the regulatory requirements Marcus had dismissed as minor hurdles were actually significant obstacles that would require months of additional work. I'd raised these concerns with Marcus privately, but he'd brushed them off. Find a way to make it work, Sarah. That's what problem solvers do. When I'd pushed back, explaining that his promises to Meridian were literally impossible to fulfill, he'd gotten defensive. Look, I sold them on the vision. Your job is to execute it. If you can't handle it, I'll find someone who can. So I'd done what any good consultant does when facing an impossible situation. I'd documented everything. Every email, every meeting note, every technical requirement that made Marcus's promises undeliverable. I'd created a comprehensive file showing exactly how his deal with Meridian was going to collapse, and I'd sent regular updates to Marcus warning him about the impending disaster. He'd ignored every single one. 3 months into the Meridian implementation, the project was failing spectacularly. Deadlines were being missed, costs were spiraling out of control, and the client was getting increasingly frustrated. Marcus, meanwhile, was blaming the failures on execution issues and resource constraints, never acknowledging that the fundamental problem was his impossible promises. That's when I realized I had everything I needed. I started putting together what I privately called the Marcus file. It wasn't just about Meridian, it was a comprehensive documentation of every corner he'd cut, every promise he'd made that he couldn't keep, every time he'd thrown someone else under the bus to protect his own reputation. The Henderson project where he'd stolen my work. I had email chains showing my original research and strategy development, timestamped weeks before Marcus had even been briefed on the client. The client testimonials that had helped him get promoted. I had documentation showing that 2 of them were from projects he'd had minimal involvement in, and the third was from a client who'd specifically requested to work with me again. The restructuring of my client portfolio. I had evidence that he'd reassigned my highest performing accounts to less experienced team members, setting them up for failure while taking credit for any successes. But the crown jewel was Meridian. I had everything: the original proposal Marcus had submitted, my detailed analysis of why it was impossible, my warnings about the impending failure, and a paper trail showing how he'd ignored expert advice to protect his own ego. The question was, what to do with it all? I could have gone to HR, but Marcus had been careful to operate within the gray areas of corporate politics. What he'd done was unethical, but it wasn't necessarily against company policy. I could have gone to Janet, but she'd already bought into Marcus's narrative about my performance. She'd probably see it as sour grapes from someone who'd been passed over for promotion. I could have taken it to the senior partners, but they'd been the ones who'd promoted Marcus in the first place. Making them look foolish for their hiring decision wasn't a recipe for success. So I waited. And I planned. The opportunity came 2 weeks later when Marcus called an emergency meeting about the Meridian situation. The project was now 3 months behind schedule and 40% over budget. The client was threatening to terminate the contract, which would not only cost us $2.3 million in annual revenue but could also damage our reputation in the industry. Marcus stood at the head of the conference table, looking notably less confident than usual. "We're facing some challenges with the Meridian implementation," he began. "There have been some unforeseen complications." Janet leaned forward. "What kind of complications?" "Well, the regulatory environment has been more complex than initially anticipated. And there have been some resource allocation issues." I watched him squirm, using the same vague language he'd used to dismiss my concerns months earlier. This was my moment. "Actually," I said, "I think I can provide some context on the Meridian situation." Marcus's eyes snapped to mine. "Sarah, I don't think. I've been closely involved in the implementation," I continued, "and I've documented the challenges we've been facing. Would it be helpful if I shared that analysis?" Janet nodded. "Yes, please. We need to understand what went wrong." I opened my laptop and pulled up the presentation I'd been preparing for weeks. The issues with Meridian aren't really about unforeseen complications. They're about fundamental problems with the original proposal. For the next 20 minutes, I methodically dismantled Marcus's deal. I showed how his timeline had been impossible from the start, how his cost projections had ignored essential regulatory requirements, and how his promises to the client had been based on strategies that simply couldn't work in their industry. Every slide was backed up with documentation. Email chains where I'd raised concerns. Technical analyses showing why his approach was flawed. Meeting notes where I'd warned about specific problems that had since materialized. The room was silent as I clicked through the evidence. Marcus's face went from pale to red to pale again. Janet was taking notes, and I could see her connecting the dots. "When did you first identify these issues?" she asked. 3 months ago. I documented them in my weekly reports to Marcus. I pulled up the email chain. I sent detailed warnings about each of these problems, with recommendations for how to address them. And what was the response? I looked directly at Marcus. I was told to find a way to make it work. When I explained that the fundamental assumptions in the proposal were incorrect, I was told that my job was to execute, not to question the strategy. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Janet spoke. "Marcus, is this accurate?" He cleared his throat. "Sarah, I think you're oversimplifying." "Actually," I interrupted, "I have the email chains if you'd like to review them. Including the one where I recommended contacting Meridian immediately to reset expectations, and the response I received." I pulled up the email where Marcus had written, "We made a commitment to this client, and we're going to honor it. I don't want to hear any more excuses about why it can't be done." The meeting ended with Janet announcing that she needed to review all the documentation and would be scheduling individual meetings with everyone involved. Marcus tried to approach me afterward, but I gathered my materials and left without giving him the chance. Over the next week, I provided Janet with everything I had. Not just about Meridian, but about Marcus's entire pattern of behavior. The stolen credit, the impossible promises, the systematic undermining of team members who posed a threat to his advancement. I also did something else. I reached out to Sarah Chen, a former colleague who'd left Davidson and Associates 6 months earlier. Sarah had been one of Marcus's early victims, pushed out of the company after he'd taken credit for her work on a major project. "I always wondered if anyone would see through his act," she told me over coffee. "I kept hoping someone would speak up, but he was good at isolating his targets," I finished. "Making each of us think we were the only one having problems with him." Sarah agreed to provide a statement about her experiences with Marcus. She also connected me with 2 other former employees who'd had similar experiences. A pattern was emerging. The investigation took 3 weeks. During that time, Marcus tried everything to control the narrative. He scheduled meetings with senior partners, attempted to blame the Meridian failure on communication breakdowns within the team, and even tried to suggest that I'd been deliberately sabotaging the project. That last accusation was his biggest mistake, because I had documentation showing that I'd been doing everything possible to save the project, despite being given an impossible task. My emails to Marcus weren't just warnings, they were solutions. Detailed recommendations for how to address the problems he'd created. When Janet called me in for the final meeting, I knew it was over for Marcus. "We've completed our review," she said. "And we've made some decisions about the department structure." Marcus was being demoted immediately. He would no longer manage any client accounts, and he would be placed on a performance improvement plan. If he didn't meet the specified benchmarks within 90 days, he would be terminated. I, meanwhile, was being promoted to the senior manager position that should have been mine in the first place. My first responsibility would be salvaging the Meridian relationship, which Janet acknowledged would be challenging but not impossible. We're also implementing new oversight procedures, Janet continued, to ensure that this kind of situation doesn't happen again. Marcus lasted exactly 73 days. He couldn't handle the reduced responsibilities, the constant scrutiny, and the fact that everyone in the office now knew exactly what he'd been doing. He submitted his resignation on a Thursday afternoon, citing new opportunities that better aligned with his career goals. I heard through the industry grapevine that he'd struggled to find another position. Word had gotten out about the Meridian disaster, and consulting is a small world. His reputation had been damaged beyond repair. As for me, I did manage to save the Meridian relationship. It required some difficult conversations, a completely restructured timeline, and a significant amount of additional work, but we delivered on a modified version of the original promise. The client was satisfied, and the project actually became a case study in how to recover from early implementation challenges. The senior manager position turned out to be everything I'd hoped for. I rebuilt the department culture, implemented better communication protocols, and created systems to ensure that credit was properly attributed for everyone's work. Within a year, our client retention rate had improved by 23%, and our team satisfaction scores were the highest in the company. But the real victory wasn't professional, it was personal. Marcus had tried to destroy my career because he saw me as a threat to his advancement. He'd systematically undermined my reputation, stolen my work, and attempted to force me out of a company where I'd spent 6 years building relationships and expertise. In the end, his own behavior destroyed him. I didn't have to lie, cheat, or manipulate anyone. I just had to document the truth and wait for the right moment to share it. The last time I saw Marcus was at an industry conference about 6 months after he'd left Davidson and Associates. He was there with his new company, a smaller firm that specialized in short-term consulting projects. He looked older, more tired, and definitely less confident than the golden boy who'd once commanded every room he entered. We made eye contact across the networking reception, and I saw something in his expression that looked like recognition. Not just of me, but of what had happened between us. He knew that his downfall had been his own doing, and he knew that I'd simply been the one who'd refused to let him get away with it. I nodded politely and turned back to my conversation with a potential client. After all, I had work to do. The funny thing about revenge is that the best kind doesn't feel like revenge at all. It feels like justice. Marcus had spent months trying to destroy my reputation and career, but in the end, he'd destroyed himself. All I'd done was make sure the truth came to light. And sometimes, that's enough.